I hadn't even finished setting down my bags when the first knock rattled my front door like a warning shot. On the other side stood a woman with a clipboard clutched like a weapon, her eyes scanning my yard as though she already owned it. Before I could speak, she barked rules I'd never heard of, violations I'd never committed, and threats that carried the weight of eviction. This wasn't a friendly neighborly visit. It was an ambush, staged on the very steps of a home I thought was finally mine. And as her words grew sharper, one thought cut deeper. What happens when the people next door think they control your life? The house had been standing long before I ever set foot on its creaking wooden porch. To most, it was just an old property tucked at the edge of a quiet community, its weathered beams and pine-framed windows whispering stories of a century past. To me, though, it was an inheritance that carried weight, not just in property lines and fences, but in memory. My grandfather had poured his life into every inch of that land. When it became mine, I felt the same mixture of pride and responsibility that had defined him for decades. Life in the neighborhood seemed deceptively calm at first. Mornings brought the low hum of lawnmowers, the soft chatter of neighbors walking their dogs, and the comforting routine of a community that looked, from the outside, like harmony. The road bent in a perfect curve around the houses, mailboxes, stood neatly in a row, and flower beds bloomed in colors that seemed almost coordinated. It was the kind of place where you'd expect smiles at the grocery store and polite nods at the gas station. In this place, disputes seemed unlikely, even impossible. Moving in, I tried to soak in the good parts. The scent of pine still lingered in the hallway, just as it had when my grandfather walked those same boards. His old boots still sat by the door, cracked and worn from years of labor. To me, that house wasn't just shelter. It was history. I wanted to honor it, preserve it, live in it without anyone else's interference. That's what made the peace of the first few days feel so deceptively fragile, like a bubble waiting to burst. Neighbors came by with cautious curiosity. Some brought pies, others extended half-hearted greetings. I noticed the way their eyes lingered on my yard, my porch, even the siding of the house, as if measuring it against some invisible checklist. At first, I brushed it off. Every neighborhood had its quirks, I thought, but something in their smiles felt rehearsed, stretched a little too tight. The first letter in my mailbox was harmless enough, a welcome note printed neatly on HOA stationery, reminding me of community standards and shared expectations. I read it twice, frowning at phrases that felt more like orders than greetings. Words like enforcement, compliance, and violations jumped out, stark against the polite tone. I set it aside, telling myself it was just paperwork, nothing to worry about. But it planted a seed, a quiet unease that settled in my chest. That unease grew as I walked the neighborhood more. The houses looked uniform, almost unnervingly so. Identical paint shades, perfectly trimmed lawns, even the same brand of mailbox. Every detail felt controlled, as if creativity had been banned at the property line. My own home, with its rustic charm and slightly wilder edges, stood out like a stubborn reminder of the past. I started to wonder if that difference would become a problem. It wasn't until I overheard two neighbors whispering just beyond my fence that the reality began to sink in. Their voices carried that sharp edge of gossip, the kind that pricks your ears even when you don't want to listen. They spoke about violations, about enforcement, and unmistakably about me. My name, my house, my yard, already the subject of conversation I hadn't been invited into. Still, I wanted to believe the best. I tried to think this was just small-town chatter, nothing more. After all, I had just moved in. Surely they'd give me time to settle, to adjust. Surely they'd see I respected the property, the history, the neighborhood. But deep down, I could feel the tension building, like a storm pressing against the horizon. Looking back, the warning signs were everywhere, in the staged politeness, in the careful stares, in the way rules seemed to hang in the air heavier than the scent of flowers. This wasn't a neighborhood built on trust or kindness. It was a neighborhood built on control, and I was about to learn just how far some people would go to enforce it. And when that first knock came at my door, sharp and impatient, I realized the quiet days of settling in were over. The dispute wasn't coming. It had already begun. The first letter was easy enough to ignore. I folded it, set it on the kitchen counter, and told myself it wasn't worth worrying about. But ignoring it didn't stop the second one from showing up, or the third. Within the first month, my mailbox had become a daily reminder that I was being watched. The HOA didn't waste time. They began small, pointing out supposed violations that bordered on ridiculous. A flower pot on the porch that wasn't the approved color. A mailbox that did not conform to community standards, even though it was the same one my grandfather had kept for decades. Grass that was, according to them, half an inch taller than regulation. Each letter came with a sterile politeness that only made the threats worse. Every notice ended with the same bold warning. Failure to comply may result in fines or legal action. At first I tried to play along. I repainted the flower pot. I measured the lawn down to the fraction of an inch. But no matter what I did, another violation appeared. It felt less like enforcement and more like a campaign, a deliberate effort to grind me down. The neighbors noticed too. A few avoided eye contact when they walked past my fence, pretending not to see the HOA notices taped to my door. Others smirked, shaking their heads as if I'd brought this on myself. But one thing was clear. I was being singled out. My house, with its history and its slight defiance of uniformity, had become the target. The fines started small, almost laughable. $20 for a paint shade discrepancy, $50 for unapproved landscaping. But they escalated quickly. Within weeks, I was staring at a stack of letters demanding hundreds of dollars for offenses I couldn't even understand. One notice accused me of improper seasonal decorations. Another claimed my porch light was too bright, disturbing the aesthetic balance of the street. I began to realize this wasn't just about rules. This was about control. The final straw came one morning when I stepped outside to find an HOA representative standing in my yard, clipboard in hand, snapping photos of my property without permission. She didn't even flinch when I confronted her. She rattled off my violations like a prosecutor building a case, then walked away without so much as an apology. My stomach churned with anger. This wasn't oversight. It was harassment. That night, I spread the letters across the kitchen table. Each one was a reminder of the absurdity, the pettiness, and the growing hostility. My grandfather's house, which had once been a sanctuary, now felt like a battlefield. And I knew. This was only the beginning. The letter was short, but its message landed like a punch to the chest. Failure to comply will result in legal proceedings, up to and including eviction. Eviction. On land that had been in my family for over a century, the land I had inherited legally. I stared at the paper, rage boiling in my chest. The absurdity was staggering. They weren't just fining me anymore. They were threatening to take everything. The harassment escalated in ways that went beyond paperwork. I'd find anonymous complaints left on my porch, notes scribbled with accusations. Your yard is bringing down property values. This house doesn't belong here. Sometimes the words were underlined so hard the paper tore. Then came the so-called inspections. HOA officials began showing up without warning, circling the property, pointing, whispering, jotting down notes. Once, I caught one peering through a window, clipboard angled as if they were preparing a report on my curtains. My privacy was evaporating. Fines continued to pile up. $200 for non-standard shutters, $300 for failure to maintain landscaping, $500 for structural non-compliance, a phrase so vague it could mean anything. Within 2 months, The HOA claimed I owed over $5,000. But the intimidation wasn't just financial. One morning, I walked outside to find my fence had been spray painted with the word violation in red letters. Another time, my garbage cans were tipped over, their contents scattered across the yard. I couldn't prove who did it, but the timing was too precise to be random. The community that had once seemed picture perfect now revealed its cracks. Some neighbors whispered encouragement, telling me to hang in there. Others crossed the street to avoid me, afraid of being associated with the person the HOA had marked as an enemy. Isolation set in like a cold draft through the walls of the house, but I wasn't ready to back down. I started keeping records, every letter, every fine, every unwelcome visit. I documented dates, times, and even snapped photos of the HOA representatives trespassing on my land. My kitchen table, once a place for meals, had become a war desk covered in files and evidence. The more they pressed, the more determined I became. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every homeowner who had been bullied into silence, every family who had paid fines out of fear, every neighbor who had swallowed their anger to keep the peace. And then one night, as I stared at the growing pile of evidence, an idea struck me. The HOA wanted a war, but I had a weapon they didn't know about yet, something that could turn their entire campaign against them. The stack of notices, fines, and threats on my kitchen table had grown so thick it looked like a legal textbook. Every page screamed one message: "You don't belong here." And for weeks, I had lived under that pressure, waiting for the following letter, the next knock, the subsequent petty violation they could twist into a punishment. But the letter that arrived one chilly morning wasn't like the rest. This one was stamped with bold red letters across the top. Final notice. The words cut through me. Failure to comply will result in immediate legal proceedings for removal from the property. Eviction. I stood there, the letter trembling in my hands, my breath catching somewhere between disbelief and fury. Eviction from the land my grandfather had poured his life into. From a home that had stood against storms, droughts, and wars, but now was under siege by a homeowners association with too much power and too little humanity. I knew then that this had gone far beyond harassment. This was war, and it was. Time to stop playing defense. I called their bluff. My first move was simple but loud. I filed a formal complaint with the State Housing Board. Every violation, every fine, every trespass was meticulously documented in the folder I had been building for weeks. I made copies of everything and sent them not only to the board, but also to a lawyer, a local news outlet, and most importantly, the office I knew would raise eyebrows, the state governor's office. Because what the HOA hadn't realized yet was this: I wasn't just another homeowner struggling under their thumb. I was the very authority they thought they could intimidate. The first crack appeared when the housing board responded within days. They requested records from the HOA, demanding justification for their fines and enforcement methods. Suddenly, the confident tone of their letters wavered. The following notice I received was strangely polite, almost apologetic, as if they were scrambling to reframe their tactics. But I wasn't done. The HOA had scheduled a mandatory hearing at the community center, a meeting designed to shame me into submission publicly. The notice had all the pomp of an official summons. Attendance required, fines reviewed, violations discussed. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted me humiliated in front of my neighbors. I decided to give them exactly what they wanted. Only the ending wouldn't go the way they had planned. Night of the hearing, the community center was packed. Folding chairs lined the room, neighbors whispering behind their hands as I walked in. At the front sat the HOA board, their clipboards stacked high, faces tight with smug authority. They looked at me like a predator looks at prey, sure of the outcome, confident in their control. The chairwoman of the board, a sharp-eyed woman with a voice that cut like glass, opened the proceedings. She listed off my supposed violations with theatrical flair, pausing after each one as though expecting gasps from the audience. Unapproved mailbox, non-standard shutters, landscaping violations, failure to comply with community regulations. Her voice dripped with contempt, and I could see the smirks spreading across the faces of her fellow board members. When she finally finished, she folded her hands neatly and leaned back. Given the severity and frequency of these violations, the board recommends a fine of $7,500 and, if not paid, immediate eviction proceedings. The room buzzed with whispers. My neighbors shifted uncomfortably, some shaking their heads, others smirking in satisfaction. It was precisely the spectacle the HOA had wanted, but I wasn't there to play their game. I stood slowly, holding the thick folder of evidence in my hands. My heart pounded, but my voice came out steady. I appreciate the board's enthusiasm. But before we continue, I'd like to introduce some evidence of my own. I laid the folder on the table with a sharp smack, papers spilling across the surface, photos of board members trespassing on my property, copies of every fine, every vague violation, every threatening letter, side-by-side comparisons of my home with others in the neighborhood that were never fined for the same supposed offenses. And at the very top, stamped with the seal of the State Housing Board, was a formal notice of investigation into the HOA's practices. The chairwoman's face paled. She reached for the papers, flipping through them with a growing look of panic. The whispers in the room shifted, confusion, then curiosity, then something else, sympathy, but I wasn't finished. "Every single one of these fines has been documented," I said, my voice rising. "Every trespass, every harassment, every attempt to intimidate me into leaving my own property. And I'm not the only one. Many of you in this room have faced the same treatment, haven't you?" The room erupted. Neighbors who had sat silently now nodded, murmuring agreement. One man stood up, his voice shaking with anger. "They fined me $200 because my kid's bike was left on the lawn overnight." Another woman added, "They told me to cut down my tree because it wasn't the right type of pine." The board tried to shush them, but the tide had already turned. For the first time, the power wasn't in their hands. Then I dropped the final blow. "By the way," I said, pulling out a final document, "in case the board hasn't done their research, they should know exactly who they've been threatening." I unfolded the paper, revealing the seal of the governor's office, and placed it in plain view. Gasps filled the room. The board members leaned forward, eyes wide. "I'm not just a homeowner," I continued. "I'm the governor of this state, and I can assure you this abuse of power will not go unchecked. Not against me. Not against anyone in this community." The room fell into stunned silence. Then, slowly, applause began. Hesitant at first, then growing louder until the walls of the community center shook with it. Neighbors stood, clapping, cheering, voices rising in unison against the very people who had controlled them for years. The board sat frozen, their faces drained of color. For the first time, they weren't the ones holding the clipboard. They weren't the ones dictating the rules. They were the ones on trial. That night was the turning point. The HOA's grip on the neighborhood cracked under the weight of its own corruption, exposed not just to me, but to the very people they had ruled over with fear. The smug authority they had carried into the meeting evaporated, replaced by panic and shame. As I walked out of the community center, neighbors clapped me on the back, whispered their thanks, and asked what would happen next. I didn't have all the answers yet. But I knew one thing. The war wasn't over. The battle lines had shifted, and now the HOA was the one scrambling to survive. And as I stepped into the cool night air, one thought burned brighter than the rest. They thought they could evict me from my grandfather's land. But they had just declared war on the governor himself. The night of the hearing had changed everything. Walking out of that community center, I felt the shift in the air as clearly as the calm wind that brushed against my face. For weeks, I had been the target, the outsider, the rule breaker, the villain in the HOA's carefully crafted story. But that night, the script flipped. The neighbors who once whispered behind my back were suddenly speaking up, their voices carrying anger, relief, and, for the first time, unity. The very next morning, my phone rang with a call from the state housing board. The official's voice was calm, professional. Still, there was no mistaking the weight of their words. "We've opened a full-scale investigation into your HOA." It was the sentence I'd been waiting for. The investigation unfolded faster than I could have imagined. Inspectors combed through the HOA's financial records, uncovering years of shady practices, misused funds, unexplained administrative fees, and a long history of selective enforcement came to light. Fines had been levied against sure homeowners, often the newer ones or those who resisted too much, while others, usually friends of board members, enjoyed quiet exemptions. What had once felt like a personal vendetta against me turned out to be a system of abuse that had been festering for years. I was just the one who had pushed back hard enough to crack it open. Neighbors who had once been silent suddenly found the courage to speak. Stories poured out like water breaking through a dam. One family described being fined for having the wrong shade of curtains visible through their window. Another told of being threatened with foreclosure because their doghouse wasn't community approved. The more they spoke, the clearer it became. This wasn't about order or beauty. It was about control, intimidation, and greed. And as those stories piled up, so did the evidence. The climax came not in a courtroom, but in a town hall packed with residents and overseen by the housing board. The HOA board members sat stiffly. At the front, their once smug expressions replaced by the pale, anxious looks of people who knew their empire was crumbling. When the findings were read aloud, the room buzzed with disbelief and vindication. The board had overstepped its authority repeatedly, violated state housing regulations, and in some cases even broken the law. The decision was swift. The HOA was to be dissolved, pending a complete restructuring under state oversight. Cheers. Followed the gasps that filled the room. For the first time in years, the community wasn't afraid. They were free. For me, the victory was more than personal. It was justice. My grandfather's house stood where it always had, unbothered, unyielding, just like him. The fines, the threats, the eviction notices, all erased. In their place, a letter of apology from the State Housing Board, acknowledging the HOA's misconduct and affirming my full rights to the property. But perhaps the most potent change wasn't in the paperwork. It was in the neighborhood itself. The people who once avoided eye contact now stopped me on the street to talk. They asked questions, shared their stories, and for the first time seemed to see each other not as rivals in some competition for property value, but as neighbors. Real neighbors. Some families, tired of the constant pressure, had quietly considered moving away. But after the HOA's collapse, they stayed. Gardens grew fuller. Kids' toys appeared on lawns without fear of fines, and holiday decorations lit up the streets in a way they never had before. It wasn't perfect. No community ever is. But it was finally real. The former board members, stripped of their power, scattered into the background. A few moved away entirely, unable to face the people they had once controlled. Others stayed, quieter than before, their influence gone. The clipboard inspections, the letters, the threats, they all disappeared, replaced by a community committee built on transparency, fairness, and voluntary cooperation. And me? I kept the evidence binder on a shelf in my office as a reminder, not just of what I had fought, but of why it mattered. Because here's the truth. The fight was never just about me or my house. It was about standing up to people who believe they can control others simply because they have a little power and a lot of arrogance. It was about proving that when one person pushes back, it gives others the courage to do the same. Looking back, now I can still see the arc of it all. I felt that there was a quiet unease when I first arrived. The petty fines that escalated into threats. The fear that they might really take everything away. And then the shift. The moment I realized the only way out was through, and the only way to win was to shine a light on what they'd been doing in the shadows. The impact went beyond the neighborhood. The local news picked up the story, running a piece on HOA overreach. Other communities reached out, asking how they could challenge their own boards. The Housing Board began reviewing HOAs across the state, promising reforms to prevent the same abuse from happening again. What started as one dispute on one property rippled outward, touching people I'll never even meet. But the most lasting impact was personal. For weeks I had lived under the weight of their control, my home turning into a prison of constant surveillance and fear. And yet, standing there in the aftermath, looking out over my grandfather's land, I realized something. I had reclaimed more than just property. I had reclaimed peace. The porch still creaked under my boots. The scent of pine and old leather still lingered faintly in the halls. The land was still mine, still ours, standing strong against anyone who tried to take it. And now, when I see neighbors walking their dogs or children riding their bikes down the street, I don't see a controlled community marching in step. I see people finally living freely, unburdened, unafraid. There's a lesson in all of this, one I won't forget, and one I hope others never have to learn the hard way. Rules can bring order, but when rules become weapons, they destroy the very communities they're supposed to protect. And power, no matter how small, has a way of corrupting those who cling to it too tightly. That's why it matters to push back. That's why it matters to speak up. Even when you're outnumbered. Even when the odds seem impossible. Because sometimes, all it takes is one person refusing to bow down to remind everyone else that they don't have to either. As for me, life settled into something quieter, steadier, and infinitely more rewarding. The house was no longer a battlefield. It was a home again. My home. The fines, the threats, the fear. All of it was gone. In its place was laughter on the streets, freedom in the air, and a reminder that legacies aren't just built on land or property, but on the courage to defend them. And every time I step onto that porch looking out over the land my grandfather left me, I think about the night everything turned. About the moment the HOA's power crumbled under the weight of its own arrogance, about the applause that filled the community center when the truth finally came out. And I know, without a shadow of doubt, that they picked the wrong person to fight. Final takeaway. When someone tries to strip you of what's yours, your land, your home, your peace, you have two choices: surrender or stand. I stood, and because of that, this community finally learned what it means to live free. And now I'll leave you with this question. If it had been you, standing on that porch with a clipboard shoved in your face, would you have backed down, or would you have fought?